we all had been exposed to. And it turned out all of us had either had measles or had had children who had measles and been exposed and had antibodies, because they took blood samples and sent them to some doctor that was the whiz on German measles in Cincinnati, I think, and he analyzed it and said Ken Mattingly, unfortunately, he was a bachelor, had never had measles, that he was highly susceptible to come down on the flight. So poor Ken was taken off the flight, and Jack Schweigert, command module pilot on the backup crew, replaced Ken 2.5 days before launch. Now, but as I said, the concept we had was we were trained to go fly the mission as a backup, immaterial of whether you were prime or backup. Now, normally, if one of the limb guys had gotten ill, you change out both limb guys. So you change out the commander and the lunar module pilot. But the command module pilot was the guy that stayed in orbit, so he was have to operate on his own anyway. So he had to be totally capable with the command module. So that made it an easy swap of 1-for-1 in that case. So that was it was not a mission success or safety or anything else issue. It was a very personal problem and emotional problem we dealt with that crew changeout. We worked as a crew with Jim TK Mattingly, Ken Mattingly, through Apollo 11 backup, and now this mission we finally get him to go and get yanked off. Horrible disappointment. And of course then the change out with Jack. He was also a bachelor, incidentally, so he couldn't invite friends and relatives. He might want to come see the launch, come see him. Personal preference kit he could have flown for items people wanted to fly. So it's more that kind of thing, not the problem of going to fly the mission. So that we dealt with right in. It's kind of maybe, I'll say, not as emotionally excited or a little flat as I went out to the launch pad that day to launch, that we're now launching without Ken. And I knew Jack, he was in my group, so I knew him well. It wasn't any personal thing that way, but it was that just changed the tenor of that day, that launch day for us. And I had seen it, the Apollo 8 and 11, I was on the backup, on the closeout crew. So I was the last one out of the capsule on both those missions. I was the last guy out of the capsule before they closed the hatch on both 8 and 11. And I could see those crews were really hyped. They were really ready to go. They were excited. And we didn't have quite that same excitement when we got crawled in the capsule on 13 to start with. The mission itself went well. We only had one, I call it a minor problem, because it turned out to be minor. We had a shutdown of the middle engine on the second stage on the way up 2 minutes early, which for a few moments caused us a thinking a problem that would cause us not to be able to go to the moon, because we knew if the engine shut down, it'd use more fuel getting us up and getting us into orbit. And the third stage with the single engine would have to burn longer to do that, to get us in orbit, so there might not be enough fuel left to get us to the moon. So we sweated that out for a little bit, but then the mission control figured out the reserves and we'd be able to proceed. When we got on the way to the moon, everything was pretty calm, and Joe Corwin was the Capcom in Mission Control. One time he piped up to us that just said, we're all bored to tears down here, because so everything was going so great. We staged a TV show, was planned at just after 2 days approaching the moon. We were about 200,000 miles out, a little more, and we had the show and tell TV show, and they just finished it, and I was still putting away equipment. We had pulled out equipment to talk about and explain for the audience. We thought no major networks carried that show. Mission Control enjoyed it. And I was still putting away stuff, and we had this huge bang. Structures on spacecraft are metallic, so it's kind of like somebody pounding on something with a sledgehammer. And all the attitude jets, small 100-pound thrusters, were firing sporadically, trying to hold attitude, because what we saw later, we didn't realize that at the time, 1/4 of the service module had blown off with the explosion of an oxygen tank, and that had imparted a big torque to the vehicle. And in that turning torque, those attitude thrusters were automatically firing to try to hold attitude, stabilize. From there, it went to go back up. I left the limb where I was. Jim had already started through the tunnel to get back to the mothership, the capsule. And when I got there, I saw an array of lights, about 7 caution warning lights. Very confusing. The spacecraft of those days was very simple. There was no centralized computer integrated across systems like most of your cars are today in some respects, but all airplanes and systems were simplex for the most part. All stood alone. We operated most things manually. That's why you saw a lot of switches and that and circuit breakers on the panels. The only thing the computer did, and it was a 1/10 of a megabyte computer, 1/10 of a megabyte hand-wired computer that served guidance, nav, and control, and that was it. So there's no reason these lights are on systems that weren't connected in any way, so that was confusing. But the real thing that made me just sick to my stomach, when I scanned further on the instrument panel, 2 meters for oxygen tank 2 were in the bottom of the gauges. 2 different sensors, which are unlikely to fail simultaneously. So I knew we had lost that tank. We lost tank 2. Now that was not life-threatening because tank 1, the gauge next, set at the gauges next, looked fine. And so we'd keep everything fully powered up, and we'd just have we'd abort. We'd have to come home. Couldn't go into lunar orbit. Couldn't land. So I lost all that time training to get ready, and now was my big chance, and it was gone in an instant. So, but it became more serious because Mission Control detected it quicker than we did. But the second tank 1 had a slow leak, and it was going down. So that was kind of, unless that we could figure out a way, and we worked the next 50-something minutes, almost an hour, doing different things of trying to stop the leak in that second tank. We knew that we had shut down, the vehicle was dying. It depended on oxygen and hydrogen to feed 3 fuel cells. That was our major electric power. We had 3 small batteries, 44 ampere hour batteries, that was just to serve entry, and we couldn't use those. So it was, the handwriting was on the wall, so that's when Jim told me to head to the limb and start getting the lunar module powered up. We hoped a good limb, as it turned out it was, and I started the power activation, and then Jim joined me, and we finished up getting very hurriedly, got the lunar module going. So we had it was called the lifeboat, and it was a home, living quarters. It had power, it had communication, had propulsion system, the engine we're going to land on the moon with, and the same 100-pound attitude thrusters. So at least we had bought time, and that's the way the mission went from there, was just having time to buy to the next hole in the now new mission plan that was evolved. Gene Krantz kind of led the Tiger team, picked people he got aside and developed this alternate plan on how we might get home. But there were holes in it and open items. And then we did it differently though than normally, or he did. Normally, if Mission Control had a problem they couldn't solve, they handed it off to the MER, Mission Evaluation Room, in an adjacent building to Mission Control. Building 30, that MER was in building 45, right next door. And there was double doors, and they had a sign over those doors to that room that said, "God is welcome, all others bring data." And that room was with various experts, the program office people, management people. It had contractor engineers and management people. And they had communication links to all of that brain trust that was out across the country. Back at the factories, the factories actually designed and developed the vehicles and manufactured them and built them and got them ready for NASA to buy to get ready to launch. So that brain trust was out there available that they called on through that route. That was the way it was normally done. But Gene did it differently. He dispatched one person for an open item and said, "Here's the problem. You have the access to any human being you want in the United States. And I want you back here," and he gave them a date, 2 days ahead. "You come back here with the answers we need." So it was a lot of pressure on specific people who many I talked to got less sleep on the ground than I got in flight during that period. But that's to shorten the bureaucracy, if you will, a bit. That's the way Gene handled that, to get the work done, and the people, right people dispatched to go work the problem. And so that's the way that was done over the next few days, to work out the things to get us back.
You worked around the clock to do that, and you made it.
Yeah, well, we loafed a lot of the times. We did, in between the times they were figuring out the next thing to do, I was just looking out the window and enjoying the sun.
Well, you did. You might as well. And you did get to go to the moon, right? I mean,
right.
we hear that, and that, you know. But what was that? What was it like? I know you were working a major issue, obviously, and that was on the back. But what was it like when you got to the moon and were able to take a look and look back? What was that experience like?
There was a couple of sensations. As we went around the backside at a higher altitude than any flight, at 130 something miles. So we got a bigger, broader view of the backside. And I mean, the noticeable thing about the backside is it's different than the front, which had those large dark areas that people can vision facing the moon. The backside doesn't have many dark areas. It's more totally crater after crater after crater, rough terrain. Few of the ones we shot pictures of had Russian names. We shot good pictures of Tsiolkovsky and Sea of Moscow, which major features we saw, but nowhere near as big as those dark areas on the front side. So more meteorites, bigger ones, apparently hit the side facing the Earth. But it was a disappointment because we came to about where the sun line was on the moon. You could see our landing site from our. So there was where I might have been, down there walking around, and I wasn't going to get to do that. So it's kind of a reminder again of our lost mission. So, but that was a lot of things we did. We used the descent engine 3 times. 1, 2, 3, yeah, 3 times. And we used 4-jet RCS using small 100-pounders the 4th time for mid-courses. The first maneuver was critical, the one we did not too long after the explosion at 60-something hours. The explosion was at 55 hours. Because we were not on a path that would have taken us back to Earth. So the first maneuver was critical to get us on that path going around the moon, which would have landed us in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean by Madagascar. It was funny, the flight controllers had changed. Gene actually, Krantz took his team, white team, off duty, and Glenn Lundy's team came on in that same time period during the troubleshooting, even in that time period. And the guidos, the people who control the trajectory, asked him, where do you want them to go? And Glenn told him, I want them to come to Earth. That was his instructions. And so that's why they gave us a maneuver that put us into the Indian Ocean, Madagascar. And they later refined it to get us back into the South Pacific near the Samoan Islands. With a major burn we did about 2 hours after passing the moon. That was the biggest, longest burn we did, using the landing engine, the engine we would have landed on the moon with, to get back in a direction that would have put us in the South Pacific, where we would have a recovery force with the Iwo Jima aircraft carrier and the trained Navy divers to retrieve us. So that's the way that went. I'll say the scariest time, a worrisome time for me of the mission, though, was you have to remember the command module, the mothership, the capsule, was never intended to be powered down in flight. Now, first of all, the mission control team, and about 25 years later, I went and dug out the tapes of the inner loops in mission control. And those people had to ad-lib how to shut the thing down, because there was no procedure. And they were arguing technically about how to do it, because they didn't want to damage anything. So in the mindsets, they were saying, we're going to get this vehicle at some point down, so we're going to power it up and we're going to re-enter. So they had not given up the ghost. Made me feel good. And the other thing was now they had to figure a power-up procedure. So there was none that powered up. So they had like 3.5 days to do that. So they got the procedure built, challenge on board. Jack Schweigert had to copy it. We had no blank paper. So they had to rip the backs off of books, the checklist and whatever to use to write the procedure down. Jack carefully numbered the pages. And then Jack and I were going to power it up. Jim stayed in the limb, Lovell, the commander, and to keep attitude control and communication. So we're now 3 hours before entry interface. 3 hours before we're going to hit the air at 25,000 miles an hour. And we're allowed to go in there, and at 2.5 hours, we're allowed to start the power up. We couldn't start it up too early because we'd have used up those entry batteries. So they pushed us as late as they thought possible to start that power up. We crawled into this cold, dark, damp. Water was everywhere. The instrument panel, the first thing we got out, 2 towels to wipe off the instrument panel and see the meters. It was covered with water. And Jack looked at me, and the first step in the procedure was to push in all the circuit breakers on 2 panels, one on each side of the spacecraft. And Jack thought, well, there's probably water behind. So he said, I tell you what, he said, I'll give you a countdown, and we'll push in 6 circuit breakers at a time, and we'll stop for about a minute and see if we smell any insulation burning. We're worried about wiring shorts. So that's the way we went through getting the circuit breakers in, and we got through them all in and nothing. And what saved us was the Apollo 1 fire, the one that killed the crew, because part of the redesign was not just the hatch redesign, but the wiring protocol in hermetically sealing all connector interfaces. So it made the wire harnesses waterproof. Because there surely was water behind there around wire bundles and everything else. So that we got through that, and Jack got a good alignment with the computer now back up, the platform up. And you have to realize that thing was 4 days shut off, froze the water tanks. The water tanks were still found frozen when the capsule was recovered on the Iwo Jima aircraft carrier and examined after entry, still frozen. So we obviously exceeded the specifications on every piece of electronics in that vehicle by a lot. Well, it came to life with that alignment, and Jack controlled it through entry, and he let it do it automatically through the computer, now powered up, and from the records kept as best they could accurately say where we splashed down, we tied for the second most accurate splashdown of the program. It's incredible. Another minor miracle.
How are we doing on time here?
So if we could take a few questions from the audience, does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Awesome. All right, so I saw your hand shoot right up over here. Before cut.
Hi, my name's Rod Whitler. I'm from California. Tell me what you know about Joe Shea and his role in the Apollo program, and especially after the Apollo 1 fire. Joseph Shea.
Okay. I have to say I did not know Joe. I was down much lower in the ranks, and that's when I was off at Grumman. In fact, when the accident happened, I got a call from McDivitt. I was in the trailer next to Plant 5 where the limbs were being manufactured and tested. And Jim just gave me instructions, told me about the fire and said, come home, don't talk to the press. So that was my instructions. I never worked with Joe. I never was in any of the program meetings. As I understand, he obviously was greatly affected personally by that accident, and had some feeling of maybe he is the leader, or the program manager, had some fault in that, which was not the case. I mean, it was maybe should have raised the flag earlier, but the problem was the situation at North American at the time, workmanship, and the way the protocol was, and specifications, if you will, for the wiring they did. And so much going on in the change-outs of things in the spacecraft. Subsystems were arriving late, so people were constantly moving stuff into the spacecraft, doing tests, and then they'd have to pull it out and do more retests. So there's a lot of people activity in the capsule, and sure some of them trampled on wiring harnesses and that kind of thing, just with that kind of activity, same way at Grumman, that was going on constantly. And I understood he really obviously was replaced from the program manager role. I think he went off to Raytheon, is what my knowledge base of what I remember, as a corporate officer at Raytheon. But I know he was personally, what I've read anyway and heard, personally affected by a guilt feeling of responsibility, which any program manager would when that happens under your watch, so to speak.
All right, we got another one right over here.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Thank you, and Mr. Massimino. Can you talk about your experience in Bethpage on the limb development and how that came into play during your time in the life, so to speak?
How my limb training? You mean at Grumman?
Yes.
No, not much of that came into play because most stuff we dealt with in the testing in vehicle was at a level below what you really did and used the vehicle in flying. So I was more in depth knowledge than I needed. For instance, to fly the limb or to be involved in these alternate procedures. So it really obviously gave me confidence in the limb because I had been so much involved in its testing and felt we had a good product that was going to enable us to last 2-day vehicle will last 4 days, which it wasn't supposed to do, and get us back.
Okay, right over here.
What did you feel like right when you like heard or like